Great, so I think we can get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum's first session on the Inclusive Resilience stream. Our session today is called Envisioning Resilience and Inclusive Futures for Asia and the Pacific. The role of policy and climate change governance in securing more inclusive resilience practices. I'm Lauren, and I will be your technical facilitator today. Please use the question and answer function for your questions, where you can also upvote others' questions. Please add your organizational affiliation to your question so that we may address you properly. The chat box is also available in case you have any perspectives you'd like to share, or if you need to reach out to me for technical assistance. Today's session will be recorded for documentation purposes. So we are ready to begin, and I'll now pass the floor to Niall O'Connor, Centre Director, Asia Stockholm Environmental Institution. Niall, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon everybody, or good morning wherever you are, or good evening. My name is Niall O'Connor, as you just heard, and I'm the Centre Director for the Stockholm Environment Institute based here in Bangkok in Thailand. We're very excited to have you all here today to help kind of kick off the inclusive resilience stream and by discussing the roles of policy and climate governance to ensure climate change adaptation and resilience practices ensure that we leave no one behind. Equity and inclusion are well-established principles in global climate policy, and they're building on a strong foundation in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in other related instruments. Inclusion is also at the core of the Sustainable Development Goals, as you know, and the specific objective of leaving no one behind. It's also an inclusion that underpins the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the New Urban Agenda, and the human rights principles of the Paris Agreement. So in all of these, inclusion is key. We need to work with it. The Asia-Pacific region, however, has high exposure to climate hazards, and that this has made resilience building an urgent priority. But if in doing this, if in resilience building efforts fail to include marginalized people and recognize their differentiated vulnerabilities, they could leave a large share of the population in danger, and as such, leave some people behind, and this is not acceptable. This is now a particular concern as the pandemic has intensified competition for the limited resources that we have, with implications for current and future actions to help build resilience to the growing threats of climate risks. We also know that climate change can deepen inequalities. It can further impoverish the poor, and it can undermine our human rights. But by exploring the 5 enablers to inclusive resilience, and today we're specifically looking now at climate and policy governance. Tomorrow we're looking at planning and processes, followed by science and assessments, technologies and practices, and then closing on Friday, hopefully looking at how we can get finance to help us invest in this and make it happen in the future. But by discussing these, we aim to uncover some of the challenges that marginalized groups face in responding to climate change, while also hopefully hearing from you all some of the solutions that you've brought to bear, some of the amazing success stories that we hear about, and some tried and tested best practices, all of which we hope will contribute to climate change adaptation policies that will be better for everyone. And to find the solutions, we will certainly need to be creative with sustainable financing. This needs to be available at community level, and we need to help to build resilience to climate change. We need to be kind of facilitating this in an inclusive and bottom-up led approach, so everybody has access to this. So today we're going to hear voices from across the region, and together we will visualize what an inclusive, adaptive and resilient future may look like, and how policies and climate governance can enable and inform what we do to try and get there. So good luck to everybody in this event. And I want to now introduce our keynote speaker, Ms. Lan Mercado, calling in from the Philippines. Lan is Oxfam's co-director for Global Strategy and Feminist Futures, and currently is also the regional director for Asia. So kind of busy lady. She's an activist, humanitarian, and a development worker with over 30 years of international experience, working with civil society groups, environmental movements, and women's rights organizations. In the Philippines, she's also a convener and founder member of Every Woman and Baigani, and is a member of the board of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, where she worked on the environmental desk. So I think we look forward to Ms. Mercado to discuss the role of power and politics in enabling or hindering inclusive resilience as we investigate the role of policy and climate governance in inclusive climate change adaptation. So Lan, I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Niall. Thank you for that introduction. Yes, indeed, it's been busy, but I thought that this meeting is supremely important. And so I've taken the time to join you and others. So I'd like to greet everyone a good day, those who have taken the time to attend the panel, and also good day to the rest of my co-panelists. And thank you to SEI for the opportunity to join you today and speak on some of the most important challenges facing humanity: climate justice, gender justice, and inclusion. Today is also the International Women's Day. So I'd like to begin by raising my fist to salute all the women who are fighting to make societies more equal and just, and to encourage men to fight alongside women in changing entrenched social norms and behaviors. Together, we have already succeeded on many battles, but we know there is more, much, much more to be done. Had times been normal, we would be meeting face to face for such a critical discussion on inclusive resilience. But unless big pharmaceutical companies waive their patents and share their research and technology so that COVID-19 vaccines can be produced rapidly and at scale, and as a public good to which access is equitable within countries and between countries, the light at the end of the pandemic tunnel remains far and faint, especially for many low and middle income countries. And within those countries, for poor, marginalized, and discriminated groups of people. We pay for this vaccine inequality with lives lost to the disease and livelihoods that collapsed as the economic impact of the pandemic rampaged alongside the spread of the virus. Amid the pandemic and economic crisis, the harm caused by climate change continues. In 2020 alone, record rainfalls, devastating floods, wrought destruction across practically all of Asia and the Pacific. Every disaster played out the differential impacts of climate change, showing how poor and marginalized people suffer more and are less able to recover, let alone bounce back and thrive. This inequality, due to class, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, physical ability, migration status, and other factors, is also paid for with lives and livelihoods lost as climate-related disasters become deadlier with every passing year that we miss national and global targets on mitigation and adaptation. There are numerous national adaptation plans, each one with a range of related legal and policy frameworks. But most of these have been top-down, lacking in representation and participation from groups that are most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. Their agenda has not been prioritized, their voices not heard, and their power unrecognized. They must be valued as important and equal partners in policymaking and climate governance if resilience is to work for all of society and not just for a few. The pandemic and the continuing climate crisis must lead us to action. Earlier, I might have sounded like I miss the old normal. Well, I don't. And if there's one thing that we must learn from 1 year of the pandemic, it is that flawed global economic systems and other forms of structural oppression can no longer remain. We need to use the opportunity presented by the crisis to create a fairer and sustainable future founded in the principles of democracy and human rights. For this to happen, the inclusion of diverse and multiple voices is necessary and essential. One of those voices belong to women. Women who are marginalized because they are both women and poor, or they belong to a discriminated ethnic group or race, or are migrants. There are many social factors that intersect with gender and intensify women's experiences of inequality and injustice. Women's concerns for equality and their agenda for resilience have to be integrated into mitigation and adaptation policymaking at all levels to ensure that decisions recognize the roles they play in their vulnerable communities and thus the necessity of their leadership in climate justice. In poor and vulnerable communities, women provide food, income, and care, work that often goes unrecognized, is underpaid or unpaid. Women are not just victims of climate change. Because of the work that they do, women know how to adapt to shocks and slow onset disasters. But deeply embedded social norms, socially constructed roles, and gender-based violence put women at a disadvantage in terms of capacity, opportunities, resources, and power. Women have been fighting to change this, and we have seen that when they are able to participate in policymaking, the resilience agenda of both women and men are met. When they are able to participate, or better yet, lead in decision-making at national and global levels, women are able to contribute to effective climate change solutions. These solutions must also address inequalities. They can't just be technical. Inequalities include extreme carbon inequality, and both need to be at the heart of COVID-19 recovery. Restrictions related to the pandemic saw global carbon emissions fall. But unless emissions continue to decline rapidly, the 1.5 degrees centigrade global carbon budget will be fully depleted by 2030. And the inequality is such that the richest 10% alone would fully deplete it by just a few years, even if everyone else's emissions immediately drop to zero. If governments resort to unequal, carbon-intensive economic growth to the benefit of the rich minority and ignore the need for inclusive resilience, the climate crisis will become uncontrollable and irreversible. The disempowered and dispossessed of their rights will suffer the most. Mitigation and adaptation actions need to happen now so we can pull back from the precipice of a runaway climate breakdown. In the past years, we have seen some hopeful but faint and still problematic signs. For example, we know that funding for adaptation, a priority for the world's poorest countries, significantly increased from around 9 billion per year in 2015 to 16 to 15 billion per year in 2017-18. But only an estimated 20.5% of bilateral climate finance went to least developed countries and 3% to small island developing states, the bulk of which were loans and other non-grant instruments, which means that climate finance might be increasing developing country indebtedness. The enduring gap in support for adaptation for LDCs and SIDS remain grave concerns. And I know that the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum is an important opportunity to go deeper into finding solutions to ongoing concerns, at the root of which is inequality in wealth, opportunity, voice, and power. But also at the root is the refusal to listen to scientists, the lack of leadership with a global vision, and the lack of cooperation between governments. Of course, all of these factors are interlinked and interdependent. And wherever we might want to start, we must end with increasing the resilience of vulnerable communities that are facing intensifying shocks from increasingly extreme weather patterns. We need governments to design progressive carbon taxes with higher rates or targeted measures for luxury carbon consumption, and use the revenues to increase the resilience of lower income and more vulnerable communities. The rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, stewards of so much of the world's forests and land serving as carbon sinks, must be protected. instead of extractive, highly polluting, industrial scale agriculture. We need to fund and support small-scale farmers and agroecological food production. And of course, there are many more. The bottom line, however, is that we need to work with and support the most vulnerable groups of people in their push for consultative and inclusive national and international processes to determine how to reduce emissions, how to help communities to adapt, and how to uphold the life and dignity of people living in places where adaptation may no longer be possible. We must direct our wealth, imagination, and talents at creating a more equal world if we want to strengthen our resilience to current and future shocks. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you very much indeed, Lan, for that. It'd be hard to pick out some of the wise words because I think the whole thing was very wise. I think it was very powerful, and I think there's a lot that we need to take from this and reflect on it and push it forward. Least of all, this whole idea of a just transition, a realigning of the finances to support vulnerable communities, and working, better cooperation, better coordination, and ultimately building better resilience for so many people who deserve it. So thank you for those very, very inspiring words. I'd like to move on then, and I want to now introduce the moderator for the session, Ms. Darini Priscilla, who hopefully will now take over and chair the rest of the session. Darini has worked with us before in the October event, the preliminary event for this, and is currently the program manager for Grassrooted Trust, a Sri Lankan NGO, set up to provide a safe space for marginalized communities, whether online or in the real world. Darini, as I said, joined us before and is a very active, creative and powerful person. So I'm looking forward to challenging all the speakers today. So I'll hand it over to you, Darini, and enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Niall, and thank you all for joining this session today. I am Darini Priscilla and I will be your moderator. Today we are going to talk about the future of inclusive resilience and how policy and climate governance can enable more inclusive climate action. So as Niall mentioned, in my work, I engage with gender and sexual minorities, immigrants, sex workers, those living with HIV, and survivors of gender-based violence. And when it comes to climate action, we must consider the participation of these historically marginalized groups, not just because they get affected just as anyone else, but also because these communities, due to existing inequalities such as unequal distribution of resources or opportunities, often are in the front line when facing the effects of climate change. So in our current reality of inclusive resilience in climate action, it's no longer a question of why we should include them, but how. On that note, I would like to kick off today's session with an activity that will challenge us to think about the future of inclusive resilience. So on your screen, you will be able to see a scale. And we're going to think for a moment about how optimistic or pessimistic we feel about the inclusive future of inclusive resilience. I want you to think about yourself for a moment. And on a scale of 1 to 10, do you think the future of inclusive resilience is getting better or worse? If you think the future is getting horribly worse, then it's a 1. And if you think it's getting really better, it's a 10. Think about where you stand. It could be a 3 or a 4 or a 10, it doesn't matter. There is no right or wrong way to answer this. Just think about how optimistic you feel at a gut level. What's your number? Secondly, I want you to think about the future of inclusive resilience. And now think about how much power do you have, or how much power do you think you have personally as an individual to change the future of resilience? On a scale of 1 to 10, are you at a 10 where you feel super powerful and you feel like you can shape the future of inclusive resilience? Or are we at a 1 where we think we don't have the power or the resources to contribute to this future? Again, what's your number? Now that we've discussed these two numbers, I would like you to go to menti.com. If we could have the link on the chat, and we could insert these numbers and see where all of us stand, to see if we are optimistic or if we're pessimistic. How do we feel? Do we feel powerful or what? You can go to Menti by clicking the link on the chat, and you will have to insert the code. The code is both displayed on the chat as well as the screen on the slide. It's 2243 4448. And if you insert the number, you will have the two questions and you can insert both the numbers. How powerful do you feel and how optimistic do you feel? I'm going to give you a couple of moments to share your answers.
Dhirani, I'm afraid, can you say this again? What do I do with 22434448?
So you have to first go to menti.com. The link is on the chat. It's right there, www.menti.com.
No, I can't do that. Menti.com.
Once you go to the website, you put in the code, which is 2243 4448. Once you go to the platform, you will get two questions about how optimistic you feel about the future of resilience and how powerful you feel. And you include two numbers, a personal number that feels right for you. If anybody is having any trouble with Menti, that's all right. We welcome you to put your answer directly in the chat. That's completely fine as well. I hope the panelists are engaging with Menti as well, so we can see where we all stand. And once we are done, Lauren will help us to show the results. Lauren, can you take us to Menti so that we can see where we stand? Ah, fantastic. All right. So if everyone can direct your attention to the screen, we can see the current results. These are live results. So it's quite interesting to see where we all stand. And it's quite an, except for one quadrant, it's quite an equal distribution. We see that some people feel that they have high power, but low optimism. We also see that there are others who feel that they have low power, but high optimism. And then there are those who feel they have high power and high optimism. And of course, we have those who feel they have low power and low optimism as well. It's quite interesting. It looks like a solar system almost. And what we will be doing today is to further discuss this distribution of power and optimism among the panelists who are present. So thank you so much for everyone who engaged in the activity. And I hope that the discussion based on this activity, discussion based on the variables of power and optimism will be productive. All right, so we're going to get started. And to discuss what inclusive resilience should look like over the coming years, we have invited an array of distinguished panelists that will each engage in one of these four quadrants that we just discussed, drawing on their experiences and ideas to discuss actions for engaging in the future of inclusive resilience. Now, before we get going, let me briefly introduce each of our panelists. First, we have Gracia Dakar. Gracia leads the agroecology team at the Northeast Slow Food and Agrobiodiversity Society, working with and for the indigenous communities of Meghalaya and Nagaland in the REC-funded project, No One Shall Be Left Behind initiative. She engages custodian farmers, women, and youth in exploring biodiversity-based indigenous food systems to contribute to a healthier and more resilient environment through their agroecological practices. Ms. Dakar will be followed by Sushila Pandit, a development professional working in climate resilience, disaster management, and sustainable development for a decade in national and international portfolios. Currently, she is working as the program manager in a multicultural resilience project at Mercy Corps in Nepal. Next, we have Dr. Jonathan Enser, who is a research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute and is also a social scientist with research interests in processes that can lead to increasingly equitable human development. His works cut across the fields of development studies, human geography, environmental governance. He has a particular focus on community-based climate change adaptation and the governance of food and agriculture at different scales. Then we have Josiah Osborne, Deputy Executive Director and Program Manager of the Pacific Islands Association of Non-Governmental Organizations. Josiah joined in 2018, and during the tenure of his work, he has been supporting members of this organization in 24 Pacific Islands and territories in strengthening their capacity, policy advocacy activities, and research. Within the climate change space, Josiah is currently managing a project on climate-induced displacement in Kiribati. Last but not least, I will invite His Excellency Nasheed, the first democratically elected president of the Republic of Maldives and the current Speaker of Parliament. His Excellency is known for his promotion of human rights and democracy and an international icon for action against climate change. All right, so now we have a super amazing, experienced panel to help us understand what the future of inclusive resilience looks like. So what we're going to do is I would like to invite the panelists to help build us on the activity that we just discussed about how power and optimism influence climate change, climate governance, and action. To do this, I will have a brief but insightful discussion with each of our speakers to discuss one of the quadrants, and I will end with President Nasheed to discuss reflections and actions for moving forward. Then, of course, we will open the floor up for any questions from the audience. Please put your questions and queries in the Q&A box and feel free to participate throughout the discussion through the chat box. Our discussion today will be based on a strategy known as futures thinking. Since the future can be shaped and changed by our actions today, it is important that we consider the impact of the decisions that we make right now. This particular session will dig a bit deeper into how our decisions impact different groups. We will look at the importance of ensuring that climate change adaptation and resilience building is inclusive and meaningfully considers the needs and voices of different marginalized groups. Today, we are not trying to predict the future, but rather think about how we can actively shape and influence policy and programming decisions that contribute to a future that we all want to live in. So without further ado, let me start our discussion with Ms. Gracia Dakar. Gracia, we will be focusing on the upper left quadrant of our square, which represents the future is getting better, but people don't really feel they have the power to influence it. So it's high in optimism, but low in power. So first off, we would like to hear a little bit about your work, especially your work with indigenous communities. Can you tell us about what kind of power do you think these indigenous communities have in contributing to adaptation efforts?
Yeah, thank you, Dharani, for the introduction. And as we know, for achieving a real climate stabilization, it's critical and necessary that we protect the world's biodiversity. And though the indigenous people constitute only 5% of the world's population, they are safeguarding about 80% of the global diversity. It's not surprising to see that Northeast India, that includes the indigenous communities of Meghalaya and Nagaland, harbors about 67% of the country's biodiversity. Now, the rights of these indigenous people are intrinsically linked to the land, and deeply rooted in this is the traditional knowledge that forms an important source of their resilience. And we have seen that the indigenous communities have customary governance where they identify or they recognize the different roles that men and women have towards preserving the biodiversity, and especially with regards to the management of natural resources. And much of these, we found that they are more agile in balancing the social, the economic, and the environmental goals. In many ways, if we look at the way of life of these indigenous people, they have shown us that humans have the choice to not be extractive, but they can instead play a positive and rich role in nurturing and promoting this relationship. Now, indigenous people have much to offer in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation. And one of the most important one being towards enhancing agriculture resilience. Now, across the world, we have seen that indigenous people, indigenous food systems are biodiverse. The indigenous crops are found to be nutritious and are quite climate resilient. They have the potential to expand the food base and also diversify the diet and meet the nutritional requirements of the global community. It's a positive observation that we have seen that the communities that are dependent on the indigenous food system were able to recover faster from the shock of the economic lockdown and the disruption in the food supply chain that was brought about by the pandemic, as compared to those communities which have adopted the conventional agriculture. Yet we see that in spite of all these positive scenes of the contribution of the indigenous food system, these systems lack formal recognition by the state, and hence we see a total absence of policy program to support and strengthen or improve these systems. In consequence, these sustainable systems are at a risk, of being replaced by alternatives, and this in turn can lead to the depletion of agrobiodiversity and the knowledge that is associated with that. And if that happens, it will lead to disempowering of the community and their ability to retain resilience in climate stress or any other challenges that face them. Uh, the indigenous people, there is a change in the narratives where indigenous people are now being viewed more as agents of conservation and not the victims of the effect of climate change. Yes, their rights are being recognized by international bodies like the UN and even mentioned in the Paris Agreement. But it is sad to say that in spite of all this, the indigenous people are still relegated to the sideline from most of the highly centralized decision-making process. So we believe that to truly address climate change and its impact, it becomes critical that the indigenous people are directly engaged, and that is what we are doing with our work. And we are trying to understand that knowledge system that they possess, the way of adaptation to the process, to the changing environmental factors. And it's a time for us that we utilize the knowledge, not just to combat climate change, but also to talk about climate justice and to look into the drivers of climate change and ensure that those who are marginalized are at the table together to build solutions that we feel the society at large can replicate and also benefit from.
Thank you, Karsha. I think you highlighted especially the importance also of agriculture resilience, which is something that is often overlooked or ignored in conversations around that. I was wondering if you could briefly mention maybe one of the projects that you're involved with right now with indigenous communities, especially during the pandemic. How is it going? And maybe you could tell us about any challenges that you might have faced while engaging with these communities.
Focused on our work, we focused on drawing attention to the sustainable indigenous food system that can significantly contribute to improved nutrition, the food security, and sustainable livelihoods. There has been challenges because most of the communities are slowly being intervened with the concept of growing hybridization, use of hybrid crops. And there was a time when those communities had to face food shortages, but because they were adjacent to communities that are strong with the practice of indigenous food system, there was a bonding between those two communities to support each other. The other thing, the positive things that we see during the course is in a short study that was done, we saw that with the pandemic or the lockdown that happened, there is a growing attention towards traditional farming practices because farmers were not able to access to the high yielding varieties of seeds. They were not able to get chemical inputs. So, but they still have the land within them. They have the rights because most of the land in among the indigenous people are community owned. So they still have the ability to resolve, to recover, and go back to their practices by learning from the adjacent communities who are still strong in the practice of the indigenous food system. So basically, there's a formulation and the exchange of knowledge between the two communities that is building up their resilience.
Thank you, Gersha. I think that was much needed, because when we talk about climate action, especially during the pandemic, there's a lot of, the optimism went really low. So it's important, I think, very interesting to see how the COVID pandemic has led to some positive changes in the climate change adaptation as well. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. All right, now moving on, I would like to invite Sushila Pandit to focus on the lower left quadrant of our square, which focuses on the belief that the future is getting worse, but people don't feel the power to influence it either. So it's low in optimism and it's low in power as well. So Sheila, to start off, I wonder if you can give us a little bit of background into your work, and if the people that you work with or partnered with have ever found that they have little power or little hope about the future of climate change and inclusive resilience.
Thanks, Dharani. I think my video is not working.
All right, we can see it now.
Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dharani, and welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's session on the International Women's Day, and we are talking about inclusive resilience. So building resilience of the most vulnerable to climate change and its impact is at the core at Mercy Corps' resilience approach. And to achieve this, we believe that transformation is required at all levels, whether it's inside the household to the negotiations that happens at the global level. But how all of these are ultimately supporting the most vulnerable is the bigger question. So when we talk about power, we talk about government, we talk about donors, the private sector, but we forget that power is within us, within the people, because we are socially constructed that power is with the bigger influencers rather than with us. So we have seen that most powerful in our society, the government or private sector, are the ones who are mostly represented and making decisions about the policy plan and priorities. And the irony is that those power holders make the decision for the poor and the vulnerable when our government structures are less inclusive and are underrepresented. It's very challenging to let the most vulnerable people feel that they have the power, and it's even challenging for the transformation of status quo and make them believe on themselves. And talking about hope, we have heard that a lot, that seeing is believing. So people see hope when they think things changes, like if the things are like starting to change in their favor. But it's hard to feel when you are not represented, or it's hard to feel when you are not heard of. So when I look at all of these, the socio-cultural economic barriers that prevent the meaningful engagement of the most vulnerable, I see a little hope and for the bigger change we are expecting to have. We also have the speaker from the Oxfam, and I love the diagram. The Oxfam shows the vicious spiral, not the circle, the spiral of the vulnerability, disaster, and poverty. And it reflects that every time a shock hits, there is little hope to get out of the poverty, and the hope of the vulnerable and the poor is shattered again. So we talk about sustainability and we talk about the long-term approaches on climate adaptation, but the unaddressed issues on inclusion, equity, diversity, and accountability will always remain a barrier for poor and vulnerable to be the part of the process and to be benefited. And at Mercy Corps, we try to overcome them through a strong social mobilization approach. We call it a household dialogue, where we work to overcome the power relation between the household, inside the household, and ultimately in the community. And also we work on community decision-making to improve the mobility of women, influencing the ability to decision-making of the poor, vulnerable, and socially excluded groups. There is also a need to invest on the admin systems, because measuring the impact of the program on vulnerable groups and looking into how vulnerable groups assess and use the capacities that the program has developed them in the face of shocks and stresses is what Mercy Corps is trying to do.
Thank you, Sushila. I think you highlighted two very important things about resilience and vulnerable groups. That is, number one, power is socially constructed, that we create it, we own it, we feel it. And also the fact that it's very difficult for marginalized groups to feel hope and optimism when they're not seen and when they're not represented in these conversations. Now, I'm aware that our discussion today, as everyone knows, takes place on International Women's Day. Happy International Women's Day, everyone. So Sheila, as someone who has worked both with women, young women, youth, could you share why you feel it's important to build climate change resilience among youth and gender minorities? Do you think these communities consider themselves to have power and optimism when it comes to climate adaptation?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Dharani, it's not only important, actually there is no option of having it. Yeah, so the resilience approach I mentioned in Mexico requires a system level approach, and we believe that a system is not complete or incomplete if we exclude a group of people or a group of communities, so particularly the most vulnerable ones. So I just want to share an example while working with the groups in the community that we got to see people represented on the groups who are like elite, experienced, and powerful people who can influence the decision making. And it's always tough to include the young people and the gender minorities in the leadership position. One reason is they don't feel that they are capable enough for the role and they can't be influencers, but also the community's acceptance for female and youth leadership is very poor. And in this time, I don't want to blame the community, as I already mentioned. This is what we have inherited. This is a patriarchal thought, and it's generational issues, and which is very tough to overcome within a shorter time in a siloed approach of our programming, designing, and implementation. So, but we should not make it as an excuse for not voting for it. This needs to be an urgent attention, and this needs to be really go on action, and we really want to empower the marginalized group to represent the governance structures and see the policy and program being designed and implemented in their favor. As you mentioned, happy International Women's Day to all. And on this day, this International Women's Day, let's challenge to change for a little move on the spectrum, which is required, and we need to work on making a small changes that is possible so that there is hope and optimism for the future.
Thank you very much, Sushila. I think a lot of what you said resonated with me, especially the bit about how the challenges that we face are mostly influenced by existing stereotypes that surround women and young people, that they're not interested or they're not strong or they're not capable. So definitely, I think something to keep in mind as we move forward today into the future. Thank you so much. Next, we have... Thank you. Next, we have Dr. John Enser. John, it's your turn now, and we will be focusing on the lower right quadrant, which represents the possibility of the future is getting worse, but people feel like they have sufficient power to influence it. So it's low in optimism, but it's high in power. John, considering your academic background, I thought we could start off by clarifying the meaning of equitable resilience. Now, equitable resilience is commonly defined as accounting for social vulnerability and differentiated access to power, knowledge, and resources. As someone who has worked a lot on political capabilities, could you further elaborate the meaning and, of course, the importance of equitable resilience?
Okay, thanks very much indeed for the introduction. So I think I'd start by saying that the definition you refer to is only part of what I would say makes up equitable resilience. Importantly, I'd argue that equitable resilience depends on resilience practice. So my argument is not about resilience characteristics like diversity or redundancy, the things that we hear about in discussions about resilience, but rather my point is that equity is more likely when practice, so the implementation of these resilience characteristics, takes into account three key points. First, as you say, policies and programs need to account for differences in people's vulnerability and their different access to power, knowledge, and resources. We cannot assume that equity will result if we act as though everyone starts from the same opportunities or constraints, and I think this is, fairly well understood. Second, I would suggest that resilience practice needs to start from people's own perception of their position within the human environmental system. How do people experience, understand and judge the opportunities, vulnerabilities and capacities that arise through their day-to-day social interactions and experience of their environment? We need to predicate our practice on discussions that enable their assessment of their position in society. And third, if imbalances of power are not to persist into the future, then we need to take seriously that some form of fundamental change in relations between marginalised groups and those that control decisions about development and disaster risk will be required. So in other words, transformation needs to be considered as part of resilience, not as a separate idea or separate agenda. And by transformation, I mean the opening of new political spaces to address risks and inequalities unmet by development. This form of transformation is implicit in recent calls for grounding resilience in forms of engagement and participation that enable resilience to be negotiated between those with different interests and values. So, for example, this might mean negotiation between local communities, marginalised groups, political stakeholders, and flood risk modellers, for example. The importance of political space is twofold. First, it's intended to address procedural and material injustices that might otherwise arise through resilience, and using political space to shift the distribution of material resources by providing access to and influence in the spaces and places where resilience projects and interventions are designed and developed. And second, and I'd say equally importantly, political space can also enable resilience to draw in the less visible causes of vulnerability that lie in social, cultural, political and economic relationships and processes. So this is the kind of structural relations that we've been discussing. And this includes how some people experience authority on the basis of their social attributes, such as caste, identity, ethnicity or gender, rendering some more powerful than others.
Thank you, John. And speaking of political capabilities and equitable resilience, could you share if there are any existing movements or people or organizations working towards this area of political capabilities? And for those who are working in this area, what are the challenges that they face and how can they overcome those challenges?
So picking up the point about political space that I was making a moment ago, political capability that you refer to emerges when marginalised groups gain access to political space. So changing their status requires not only aligning decisions with their interests, such as through consultations or focus groups, but providing them with real power to shape those decisions. And this means not only recognising the fact that some social groups are routinely dominated, maligned or rendered invisible in their public or social worlds, but converting recognition into processes of participation that enables marginalised people to devise and decide on their own interpretation of a productive and valuable life. So full political capability is achieved when hitherto marginalised groups gain full and equal partnership in decision-making processes, recognising both their right to participate and the social and historical roots of their inclusion. The aim is to provide them with real control over how resilience decisions to change their circumstances and to enable valued choices to be identified and secured. And we can see attempts to secure enhanced political capability through the work of numerous organisations that work through emancipatory models of participation. That is, their approach is predicated on participation as an open-ended process that enables marginalised groups to diagnose and design responses to the root causes of their marginalisation. And to take just one example that's appropriate today is the work of gender empowerment organisations and the approaches that they adopt, which are really great examples of this. However, what these experiences make clear is that there is a significant burden on those working on resilience. And this includes national and local authorities, domestic and international NGOs, charitable organisations and donors. And the onus here is not only on the marginalised groups and those that support them, but perhaps more importantly, it's on those in decision-making spaces and development or risk reduction planning roles. Their task is to engender and facilitate planning processes that are open to previously marginalised voices and ideas, to support stakeholders to hear and understand experiences of marginalisation, and to allow for outcomes that challenge established lines of development, authority and control. In short, much work is required with those currently in positions of power if real political space is to be opened and remain open, leading to more resilience, more equitable resilience in practice.
Thank you, John. I would just like to quickly highlight an important part that John was talking about, which was how do we achieve inclusive resilience or equitable resilience? And I think those 3 points that you mentioned are quite important. That is, number one, we have to accept that vulnerability is different from one person to another. We can't look at it as one thing, that vulnerable groups are different from one another. And number two, that we need to allow people to understand and define their own power and vulnerabilities instead of coming up with our own perceptions. And of course, finally, we need to have a fundamental change in the relationship between decision makers and vulnerable groups. Thank you so much, John. All right. Now we are going to our final quadrant, which believes the future is getting better. And hey, people feel like they have the power to move it in the right direction. So it's quite a very hopeful, optimistic quadrant there. And we have Josiah to help us understand this. Josiah, now I have given you the most hopeful, best quadrant where there is high power and then there's high optimism. In your current role with the Pacific Islands Association of Non-Governmental Organizations, you might be working with some people who are both hopeful about the future and who might feel like they have the tools and the resources to act on this future. Could you give us an idea as to what some of the NGOs that you're working with are currently doing to be inclusive in their adaptation efforts?
Thank you, Darini. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Warm Pacific greetings to everyone. I work for the Pacific Island Association of NGOs, which is a regional network of national umbrella NGOs in 24 Pacific Island countries and territories. So in terms of our work in the Pacific, as you are all aware, we are at the front line of the climate crisis, and and the fact that this climate crisis has compounded the frequency and intensity of other natural hazards such as tropical cyclones. Here in the country that I am originally from in Fiji, we just experienced 2 tropical cyclones, Category 5 and Category 1, in the past 3 months. So with the climate crisis and all the natural hazards, we have the volcanic eruptions in Vanuatu. We are one of the region's hotspots for any natural hazard. And as such, we are also called the most vulnerable people. Some of our islands, people are fighting just to be alive. When there's a king tide, the whole island is flooded, or the whole atoll in Kiribati is all flooded. So in terms of resilience, what are some of the NGOs are working to be inclusive in their adaptation efforts? In the Pacific, as you're aware, we are people who are rooted in our culture. And as such, there are NGOs that are synergizing the traditional methods of agricultural farming together with modern knowledge. And they have been sharing this, conducting training in all throughout the communities. For instance, in the Solomon Island, there is an NGO there called Custom Garden. They are very much sharing the training, the lessons they have learned to every communities, just so they are resilient to the impacts of agriculture. We have seen in some areas where the root crops normally not grown well, but now due to climate impacts, they have grown well. So many are now growing those kind of food crops or staple food just to support them. So it's both a blessing and a curse at one instance, but as Pacific Island people, we are very much resilient. It's inbuilt in us, being people of the Pacific. Many of the NGOs, that's from the community-based perspective. Some of the communities, NGOs that we are working with, they have assisted the community groups develop, especially the women, to develop their savings fund whereby they can assist them during any emergency, whether it's flooding or during any emergency, humanitarian emergency in their areas. But I would like to tell you about the story in Kiribati. We are all aware of the impacts of climate change in Kiribati. Now in Kiribati, they have what you call a whole of society or whole of island approach, where government, NGOs, and the other stakeholders, they are all coming together to try and build up their resilience. And for community-based organizations, while awaiting government's assistance, many of them are using the already available resources that they have. Much of the driftwoods that they have are used to strengthen to protect the coastline from coastal erosion. So those are some of the things that that our community-based organizations are doing on the front line. Let me move up a bit to the national level, where because many of these CBOs are members of our national umbrella platforms. At the national umbrella platforms, many of our members, for us, our role is to convene spaces, convene and coordinate NGOs in terms of resilience of policy. Yeah? So for us, for instance, in Fiji, our member in Fiji, they are mandated under the National Disaster Management Act to coordinate CSOs. As such, they have conducted extensive consultations with a current review in the National Disaster Management Act for the government. Yeah? So what they do is get all the CSOs, those who represent the women, the disability, their voices is needed in this policy space so that they can contribute not only to the National Disaster Management Act, they also contribute to the disaster policies and also the humanitarian policies. In addition, in the Pacific, as we are all aware, there are only a few countries such as Fiji, Vanuatu, who have developed their own climate change and disaster risk management. The possibility of relocation or this internal displacement is really high in some of the communities. So this is where those kind of our role as convening spaces for them to be included in those political spaces or platforms. And one of the things that we have always stressed to all the powers that be, the government, is that if they're discussing about displacement or relocation, there is a need to involve those who are affected. There is a need to have free, prior, informed consent before any relocation or displacement is undertaken. Thank you, Derini. That's for it.
Thank you, Josiah. I think that last bit about informed consent is definitely something that we all have to keep in mind. My final question to you is that when we talk about high optimism and high power, there is a question of, you were talking about how during the cyclone, people started coming together and the NGOs started helping each other. And we saw that trend during the pandemic as well, where people got together and we started helping each other. But we've also noticed that sometimes the high power, especially the high optimism we have, it's not gradual. It sometimes goes away with time. So how do you think we can keep this momentum going? How do we keep this optimism high and the power high as well?
There's a thing that we always do in Piango. If they don't open the door, we break the door open. That's just joking. Thank you, Adeline. Just to add on, in terms of how do we keep the momentum going, we really need to keep engaging, or we need to push for that space every time. To highlight some of the examples from the Pacific, as I highlight, this is one of the regions. We have a framework for resilient development in the Pacific. This is a framework that integrates, which is an integrated approach to both climate change and disaster risk management in the Pacific. This regional framework was endorsed by Pacific Island leaders in 2016. Prior to the endorsement of this regional framework, many of the NGOs, especially Piango, the other NGOs, they have been involved in terms of development and in the development of this regional framework. Under this regional framework, then we have what is called the Pacific Resilience Partnership. So in terms of the Pacific Resilience Partnership, which is a multi-stakeholder partnership, bringing together the donors, the NGOs, the national governments, the community-based, the women's group, the disability NGOs. So it brings them together to provide that high-level strategic guidance. The role of this PRP for many of us who are involved in this is to provide complementarity in terms of climate change and disaster preparedness, response, or recovery. So for us, we have been involved, even as NGOs, we've seen there are 5 technical working groups at the region. So NGOs are very much involved in terms of being co-chairs with government as well. So for the, as I already mentioned, if the door is not open, you will need to break open that door. But in the Pacific, as you know, it's such a small place, and many of these, I live in Fiji, which is the hub for many of these regional organizations. And we and many of these high-level people, we meet them along the corridors. So just building that relationship, keep engaging. For us as CSOs, we need to keep engaged to push for that space for NGOs for people, for the voices of the really marginalized people to be included in policy. Thank you so much, Darren.
Thank you, Josiah. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I must say, I'm all for breaking down those. Let's do it. All right, people. So now that we've looked at our 4 quadrants, analyzing different groups of people and different levels of power and optimism that they have. So last but not least, I would like to invite His Excellency President Nasheed. As I briefly mentioned in the introduction, President Nasheed has been an important voice for democracy, human rights, and climate change, which, as we know, are 3 important components of inclusive resilience. President Nasheed, thank you so much for being here. We're excited to have you. My first question to you is a bit of a controversial one. We've been talking about optimism and power that people have, and how this amount of optimism and power that people have impacts their engagement in inclusive resilience. In terms of power and optimism, where do you think you stand? How optimistic are you about the future of resilience? And how powerful do you personally feel to engage and shape the future of inclusive resilience? Because one might assume that nobody is more powerful than a head of the state or a speaker of parliament. But do you think it is the reality? Do you think you had the power and the optimism and the hope to shape climate action? And if you do, I would love it if you could share any advice that you have for people who might not be feeling powerful, or people who might not be feeling so optimistic about the future of inclusive resilience. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Dirani. I felt odd trying to do your survey, especially when you asked, how much power do I think I have? I am very optimistic. I have always been very optimistic all my life, and I believe that it is very important to remain optimistic. So I thought I'll give a 7 out of a 10 to my optimism. Now, in case of power, I think the more you are willing to relinquish it, the more you have it. So I have all the powers. So I have a 10 on that because I'm willing to go down to 0. And in my life, that's been the pattern. I am the head of state one time, and the next time I'm in jail. And that circle has been going on for me. So I always see power dependent on how much you want to relinquish it, how much you want to hold it, how much you want to abuse it, how much you want to use it. So I think, I don't have all the powers to do everything. That's sure. I'm unable to even do half the things that I want to do. For instance, even if we come to government with a manifesto, you would see that I would not be able to deliver even 60% of that. Today, Dharani, our question is resilient communities to help withstand the impacts of climate change. You have given me a few minutes to talk about it, but do you want to keep on questioning me and then me answering you, or do you want me to say a few words on resilience communities to help withstand impacts of climate change?
Please go ahead with a few words. We'd love that.
First, I would like to point out that resilience, we should not think it as concrete or strong. Resilience is not necessarily strong, but it can also, try to see it as more a sophistication, a delicate manner of surviving. It's not the kind of, going against nature, stopping nature, and then surviving. No, I would like to see or to think about resilience in a more delicate manner. Now, you will remember, Dharani, so many lives were lost in Sri Lanka during the tsunami. And the same wave came to the Maldives. But we lost 70 lives, of course, too much. But I feel why we didn't lose all that we were more resilient because we were more delicate, because the wave just went over us. It didn't actually necessarily recognize the mountains. It didn't break on us, but it did on Goa. It did on Sri Lanka. So resilience is, in many ways, if it's very windy, not to stand against the wind, but to bend, but to twist, but to be more sophisticated and so on. So that's one of the things I really want to talk about. Now, how do we make a resilient community? I've always said democracy is the most important adaptation measure. For both mitigation and adaptation, and to fight climate change, and to find solutions, democracy is paramount. It's very important. Without democracy, we do the wrong projects at the wrong time, at the wrong place, for the wrong cost, and you pay the wrong amount. So the whole thing is wrong. It's completely only dependent on a few people who think, at the most, who think that they are very technically clever, and who also think that they are very, in a sense, empowered and understood. And they call themselves, here they call themselves sometimes Garbi, which is professional. They also call themselves Ilmvering, which is knowledgeable. But I think the most important, the only way of finding how to do the right thing at the right time, at the right place, in the right manner, is to have a democratic structure. So I would always argue that for adaptation, you need that. In the Maldives, if you see what had happened to us, how we were able to democratize our society, how we were able to impress upon the community here, and finally how we were able to have our first multi-party elections and so on and so forth. Now, what's happening in Burma is so sad, and everything is going to go wrong in Burma now. Everything. All the adaptation programs will go wrong. Mitigation programs will go wrong. They will start building embankments at the wrong places. I also think that you need to decentralize a lot. You need to have your decision making and also implementation, monitoring, everything decentralized. And the more that the thing stands on itself in a small community, the better that it is, I feel. So I think decentralization is another thing. Women empowerment is fundamental. And this is the Women's Day. Congratulations to all women. Women empowerment is very, very important. They are 50% of our community, and not just that. They look after the young, they bring up another generation of people. They are there to do most of the work. And I think, therefore, women empowerment is very important to build a more resilient community. Then that takes us to this kind of anti-women rhetoric, narratives that usually people bring that along religious lines. But we all know that it's not in any one of our religions to suppress women. So we must stand up against these religious narratives that are now so much trying to suppress women empowerment. May it be any religion, doesn't matter. Everyone seems to be the same in that score. I think also schools need to play a very important role in this. And health centers, independent institutions, they need to do more on climate resilient and climate change issues and programs. Now, I think we should be looking at a low carbon development strategy. What I'm suggesting is we have the same economic outcomes, but through less extraction and through more recycling and through less carbon emission. The new development strategy would give you the same economic outcomes such as high employment, low inflation, GDP growth, and so on. But we must find different development patterns, pathways that would be less extraction and more recycling. I am sure that the science is now there, the methods are there, and it's just a question of bringing everything together. I am very, very pleased that the Sheikh Hasina, Bangladesh, she is announcing Mujib Prosperity Plan, I think soon, next week or the week after that. She heads the Vulnerable Forum, which is 48 countries, and I work for her now as her ambition ambassador. And one of the things that I do in this is advocate for low carbon emission. To do that, I believe that we have to adopt these prosperity plans. Now, if you take me to your topic, to bring resilience communities, we have to come with an ideology, a manifesto. Now, a low carbon development manifesto, a low carbon development ideology. Again, I'll probably be saying the wrong thing if I say this, but Das Kapital was around for a very, very, very long time. It was sitting there in a library in London, and people just read it. They thought it's brilliant writing. No one could understand it. Excellent. Until Stalin and Lenin and Stalin came and implemented it as the Communist Party manifesto. Now, what I'm suggesting is the science is there. The ideas are there. Das Kapital has been in the sense of climate idea, the new economy. The ideas are there. We need to build an ideology, a manifesto, a low carbon development strategy that has the necessary science, not just the necessary science, not the necessary governance, but also the financial structures as well. Remember, we were taught in school that air is a free good. Now, God help us. And we build an economic system based on this basic economic thinking, that air is a free good. All the others that you have to cost it and price it. So I think we need to come up with the new economics. The science is there. The new economics is also there. In today's world, renewable energy is now cheaper than most fossil fuel. California is the 5th largest economy in the world, and California is carbon neutral. So it's really, really quite possible now. Another thing on building resilience is trying to build software engineering. Now, again, you see, one of the people, how to build a resilient community is for us to try and see if the World Bank and the IMF can get into their head that these obsolete embankments, infrastructure, roads, and all these things, technology from the 20s, are being rolled out in our countries, funded by the bank. Now, harbor projects in the Maldives, for instance, shore protection in the Maldives, shore protection in Sri Lanka, building roads in Sri Lanka, irrigation in Sri Lanka. More than 90% of the water is wasted in Sri Lanka in your irrigation. And you can have far more decent irrigation systems than that. So we need the financial world, financial institutions to understand not to fund obsolete 1920s, 30s technology in our countries. We need new designs. We need new climate change designs, new designs for reclamation, new designs for shore protections, new designs for farming, new designs for road, new designs for transport. We need the new designs. And I think the technology hubs that these countries need to come up with the new designs is also very important. And that's where we have to be looking at when we do build a resilient society. Now, tradition, culture, we live with nature. We don't try to go against it. When the tide rises, you are not supposed to actually stop the thing by an embankment. Let it come in and see where it goes, and direct, channel nature in its own course and in its own path. Build a reef instead of a rock boulder water breaker. Implant a mangrove instead of an embankment. In the Maldives, to protect 1 meter of shoreline is $8,000 if you use the World Bank technology. But if you grow a reef, implant a mangrove, it's about $20. So this is very, as I speak, ADB is trying to push liquidified, another fossil fuel plant in the Asian Development Bank in the Maldives. So I think it's very important that these financial institutions move away from that kind of funding. So traditions, how can we bring in more traditional living? There is this consumerism, lavishness. Of course, happy living is very, 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 very important for a resilient community. Happiness is one of the most important. You can't be sad and overcome climate change. You can't be worried and overcome. You have to have your energy, you have to be happy, you have to be singing, you have to be dancing. I think it's very, very important that we find a lifestyle that keeps us happy. And I think that would play a very big part in building resilience. Now, I am so sorry that I've been going on and on and on. I think I have a few more
That's
points.
all right, President Nasheed. You have shared a lot and concise answer of all the questions. I would just like to reflect a little bit on the 3 things or 4 things that you mentioned. Number 1 is the importance of democracy, of course, in resilience and climate adaptation, and decentralization. And of course, not just today, I think we should enhance and talk more about women's empowerment, not just today, but every day, and how much it matters. And as someone who works in the field of education, I must say we have to start with schools. We have to start with young minds about understanding climate change and its importance. We were supposed to have a Q&A, but since we are running out of time, if there are any questions for any of the panelists, now is the time to put it on the Q&A box.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm so happy that I'm sitting with fellow Sri Lankans and having this program. I am very keen, that's why I came, because I knew that both of you were taking part. Any questions?
Any questions? And thank you, President Nasheed, for joining us today. And I would personally like to say that one thing that you said, the more you relinquish power, the more you have it. That personally resonated with me a lot, and I would keep that in mind moving forward.
No, if you're trying to get it, you'll never get it. It's like a loan. It's like a bank loan. The bank would never give you a loan if you actually don't have money. If you have lots of money, they're quite willing to give you.
Interesting take. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? If not, I would like to hand over the reins to Richard Friend, who will be making the closing remarks. Richard?
Thank you.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Well, thanks very much. This has been a fantastically stimulating discussion. We've covered an awful lot of ground. And I'd just like to pick up on a few points that have been raised during these discussions. I think the first point I would like to mention is that we have to recognize how we got in the situation we're in at the moment. And we've heard this discussion about the flawed international systems and the need for fundamental transformative change. And in this discussion, we've also heard of models of experience of what that change might look like, whether we've been talking about indigenous food systems, our experience from the Pacific, and of looking at international finance mechanisms as well. So we really have to look at this sort of large-scale, fundamental, transformative change. And we've also heard a lot about how important it is to consider who is vulnerable and the different ways in which people are vulnerable, and to recognize that vulnerability is differentiated, and that underpinning vulnerability, the reason that people are vulnerable in the first place, is very much shaped by issues of power. And if we are thinking about how we can reshape power, we have to think again in terms of individual, we've talked power within, but also our ability to mobilize. We've heard a lot of experience around social mobilization, building both on people's own knowledge, people's own experience, and bringing people together so that people are able to claim political space, to reshape political space. And as we've just heard, the fundamental challenge is around more democratic, accountable, transparent, equitable political processes, and creating new political spaces is fundamental to building equitable resilience. And in doing so, recognizing that resilience is not simply a technocratic managerial approach. So we have to think about how we got where we are, who's most vulnerable, how we can reshape futures, and who is going to be involved in reshaping a transformative resilience agenda for the future. In doing so, I think it's really important to recognize that resilience itself and the resilience agenda itself is not necessarily going to be an equitable agenda. And I think we can learn from current crisis, where we've seen amazing examples of people coming together, but state responses to the crisis in rebuilding and recovering from the crisis that forget and ignore and further marginalize the people who have been most impacted, who've been most on the front line, who have contributed in many ways most to dealing with the crisis. So we have to recognize that resilience itself is not necessarily equitable, and that what the future resilience agenda looks like will itself be shaped by power relations. And it's fundamental that we are able to engage and shape those power relations so that resilience is different. And the resilience future is different from the past and what we've and how we've got to our current situation. So we have to recognize the importance of these sort of political, democratic, decentralized, accountable processes, and recognize the risks of a resilience agenda creating further inequality and further injustices. And I would say simply underpinning resilience is an equitable resilience is a recognition that one person's resilience cannot be at the expense of somebody else's. One country's, one community's resilience cannot be at the expense of somebody else's. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That's it for today, everyone. I would just like to finish with saying that we are very grateful to our panelists, Gracia, Sushila, John, Josiah, and of course, President Nasheed. Your presence and contribution was much appreciated. And thank you to the audience for joining this session. We sincerely believe this discussion left you feeling more hopeful about the future of inclusive resilience. And closing up, I would like to say, I hope all of us here today and whoever is not here, we can work together to build a future that is powerful, optimistic, and most importantly, inclusive. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Take care, everyone. Thank you, Dharini. Good job.
Thank you for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Adaptation Forum. Please join us for upcoming sessions, highlights of Day 1, and a special International Women's Day artistic commemoration event hosted by the Embassy of Italy to the Kingdom of Thailand. You can find the link to join these sessions by returning to the Sessions tab on the APAN Forum Conference community on Ubilo. Within the community, you can also explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set up meetings with other conference attendees. Thank you once again for participating.
Thank you, Lauren, for support. And thank you, Darren. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.